I was sitting at the large oak table in our dining room, holding a glass of wine. The light from the expensive chandelier reflected in the crystal glasses, and around us was the usual buzz of our family. It was supposed to be a festive dinner. My father had finally completed the transition of the company to a new level, and I, as his right hand, was waiting for the moment when he would recognize my contribution. I had worked in the family business since I was 18. No favors, no gifts. I started from the lowest positions, proving to everyone that I was worthy of a leadership position. And now, after years of sleepless nights, working without days off and full dedication, I was sure today my father would finally announce that I would become the new CEO. "We have been going for a long time," he began solemnly, looking at everyone at the table. "And today is the moment when I can officially hand over the management of the company to the next generation." I held my breath. "I've made a decision," he paused, then smiled. "Your brother will now run the company." The wine almost spilled from my glass. I slowly looked up, trying to process what I had just heard. "What?" My heart was pounding. "It's the right choice," my father continued, not even looking at me. "He's strong, he's a leader, and you'd better do something else." I almost choked with indignation. My brother, the one who had never really worked, who skipped meetings, and had no idea how to run a company. I waited for someone to object, for my mother to support me, or at least ask me what I thought about it. But everyone was silent, even my brother, who just smiled as if that was how it was supposed to be. Then I realized everything was decided in advance. I clenched my fists, hiding my emotions behind a mask of indifference. But something inside me broke. Tomorrow at work will be a completely different day. The next morning I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I needed time to gather my thoughts and decide what to do next. Was this really the end? After everything I had done for the company, was I just being pushed aside without even being asked for my opinion? I walked through the familiar hallways, greeted the secretary, and opened the door to my office. But a new shock awaited me. My name was no longer on the sign. Instead, my brother's name was emblazoned on it. I went inside. The room was empty. All my belongings were gone. "Oh, you're here," a familiar voice said. I turned around to see my brother walking casually into his new office, as if he had worked in this office his whole life. "I wanted to tell you," he began, not hiding his smug smile. "Father decided you didn't need this office anymore. I'll be in charge, and you'll, well, find another role." I was in a frenzy. Another role. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. "Well, you know, you're good with documents. My father thinks you'd be more comfortable helping me. Something like a personal advisor or a secretary," he said, nonchalantly tossing his bag onto the desk I'd worked at for the past 5 years. I took a deep breath, trying not to explode. "A personal advisor?" I repeated, barely holding back my anger. "So, after everything I've done for the company, after years of work, training, deals, and crisis management, they want to demote me to your personal assistant?" "You're great at all those details," he said, as if he really didn't understand why I was so angry. "And I'll be in charge of the important decisions." I kept quiet, even though a storm was raging inside me. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted me to agree to be a shadow, to play a secondary role while he pretended to run the company. But I wasn't going to play by their rules. I smiled. "Great," I said, hiding my true emotions. "Let's see how long you can hold out in this chair." Because I had already started to make my plan. The next few weeks were a real test for me. My brother officially took over as CEO. My father publicly announced that the company was now headed by a talented young leader who would bring new energy to the business. Colleagues who had respected me yesterday watched warily as I was pushed aside. My new role was incomprehensible. Formally, I remained in the company, but I was removed from making decisions. I had access to documents, saw the inner workings, but my brother was only interested in one thing: how quickly you can get big profits without much effort. And he began to act. His first revolutionary decision was to change the business strategy. "We need to take risks," he declared at a meeting that I was not supposed to attend, but happened to be nearby. "We are too cautious. Let's invest all our reserves in the new project. It will pay off." I barely managed to keep from rolling my eyes. "It's too risky," I try to argue. "If something goes wrong, the company will be left without a financial cushion. You're just not thinking big, he dismissed, not even looking in my direction. Times have changed. We need to be more aggressive in our investments. I was about to say something else, but my father stood up and supported him. Enough of the doubting. We trust the new manager. I took a deep breath and remained silent. Let it be. If they don't want to listen to me now, I'll let them experience the consequences of their actions. And the consequences were not long in coming. The first failed contract turned out to be just the beginning. My brother invested in a risky project without studying the details. I knew the deal was poorly prepared, but no one asked my opinion. When 2 months later the client broke the contract and the company lost a huge amount, my brother just threw up his hands. Well, it happens, he said, laughing at a corporate party, while I stood aside and watched as the company I had built for years began to collapse. But this was only the beginning of his failures, and I knew that very soon he would realize that he could not do without me. A few weeks after the first failure, I began to notice more worrying signs. My brother continued to act self-confidently, as if nothing had happened. He avoided talking about the failed deal and acted as if the company was thriving. My father supported him, repeating the same thing. All great businessmen go through losses. It's part of the journey. But I saw the real numbers. Sales were falling, expenses were rising. The finance department cautiously hinted at the problems, but no one dared to talk about them directly. Everyone was afraid of my father. Meanwhile, my brother continued to spend company money on pointless projects. He brought his friends into top management, gave out bonuses, and bought expensive equipment that wasn't needed. I tried to talk to my father. "Can't you see what's happening?" I asked during family dinner. "The business is rapidly approaching collapse." Father just shrugged it off. "Everything is under control. You don't trust your brother, that's all." I gritted my teeth. They were all blindsided. The worst part was that the clients were also starting to notice the changes. "Your company used to work clearly and professionally," one of our most important partners said during the meeting. "Now it's chaos. If the situation doesn't change, we'll look at other options for cooperation." It was a wake-up call. But my brother didn't care. "They just want discounts," he said with a smile. "Don't take it to heart." I wanted to scream. When would my father realize he had made a mistake? I knew that sooner or later everything would fall apart. The only question was how long it would take. I remember that day well. In the morning I came to the office and saw a strange sight. The CFO, usually a calm man, was standing outside my brother's office and arguing heatedly with him. "We can't ignore this," he insisted. "The money in the account is critically low." "Relax," my brother dismissed contemptuously. "Let's take another loan and everything will be solved." Loan. I went into the office and abruptly closed the door. "I don't understand something?" I asked. "Is the company having money problems?" My brother just snorted. "You always like to dramatize. Everything is under control." I glanced at the CFO. He looked pale. "That's not true," he said. "We have huge debts. If we don't change our strategy immediately, the company could go bankrupt in a few months." I clenched my hands into fists. "And this is your successful businessman, Dad?" I asked my father angrily at a family dinner. "The company is on the verge of bankruptcy, and he's taking out loans to patch up the holes." My father frowned. "Don't exaggerate. It's not that bad." I laughed, bitterly and joylessly. "You gave him everything, and now you don't even want to face the truth." My mother looked at my brother with concern. "Son, is that true?" My brother looked away nervously. "I have a plan." But his voice no longer had the same self-confidence. For the first time, I saw doubt in my father's eyes. He was beginning to realize. But it was too late. The following weeks were like a real-time crash watch session for me. I wasn't involved in running the company, but the people I had worked with still trusted me. They would come in and tell me shocking things. "He fired half the experienced staff," said one former manager. "He thinks the young guys are cheaper and will work harder. But they don't know business. He ordered an advertising campaign for hundreds of thousands," added another, "without any calculation of profitability, just because he liked the slogan. Suppliers are refusing to do business with the company," sighed the CFO. "Payments are late. Debts are mounting." I could see the ship sinking. And the only person who didn't understand it was my brother. One evening I was sitting in a cafe when I received a text message from an investor friend. "You know your family company is on the verge of bankruptcy, right?" I clutched the phone in my hand. Yes, I knew. The next morning, the situation had reached a critical point. I arrived at the office, and there was panic. Employees were whispering in the hallways, and my brother was bustling around, talking to someone on the phone. "We need money," he shouted into the phone. "I can find a solution, just give me time." But time was running out. The door opened, and the bankruptcy trustee entered the office. He looked coldly at everyone present and said, "Your company is officially declared insolvent." Silence. For the first time, my brother looked genuinely scared. I looked at my father. He was in shock, as if he had finally realized that their great idea of passing the business on to his brother had failed miserably. But the most interesting part was yet to come. 2 days after the bankruptcy was officially declared, I received a call from my mother. "Danya, we need to talk." Her voice sounded too gentle, too forcefully calm. I knew that tone. It always came when I needed to do something for my family. "Can we meet?" she continued. I agreed, although I imagined what the conversation would be about. We met at a restaurant, not a cheap cafe, but their usual place, where they served expensive steaks and wine for hundreds of dollars. They had not yet realized that their way of life was over. My father and brother were already sitting at the table. The latter looked exhausted. With dark circles under his eyes and disheveled hair, he was clearly not feeling well. I sat down calmly across from him, my arms folded. "We know you make a good living," my father began, clearing his throat. "And we thought, maybe you could help the family through this difficult time." My brother looked up at me, his eyes full of despair and pleading. I made mistakes," he muttered, "but I can fix it if I get a second chance." A second chance. They didn't even realize the irony of their words. They didn't give me a chance. They just threw me out when I needed them most. I took a glass of water, took a sip, paused. "Do you want me to just give you money?" I asked calmly. My mother hurried over. "That's not true. We're not just asking for money. We're offering you to come back to the company, to lead it." I almost laughed. "You mean the ruined company? The one that's now in debt, without investors, and without the trust of its partners?" Father frowned, brother lowered his head. "It's a family matter," Mother began, but I interrupted her. "A family matter from which I was kicked out?" I looked into their eyes and saw one thing, fear. Fear that now I hold power, and I wasn't going to give it away, just like that. I leaned back in my chair, relaxed, looking at them with a slight smile. "It's strange." I tilted my head as if in thought. "A year ago you said I could handle it on my own, that I was strong, that I didn't need an inheritance." I met their gazes calmly. My mother pursed her lips, my father looked away, and my brother squeezed into the chair like a child about to be reprimanded. We didn't know then that everything would go wrong," my father began, but his voice seemed weak to me. "So you decided to risk everything and bet on him?" I nodded at my brother. Silence. "I'm sorry," he muttered, finally looking up at me. "I didn't think that your irresponsible attitude to business would lead to a disaster." I finished for him. "You didn't think, because you've never had to think. Your parents always covered for you." My brother frowned, and my father frowned again. "We're a family," my mother spoke again. "We've always supported each other." "Really?" I pursed my lips. "And where was that support when I asked you to leave me my share of the inheritance?" She opened her mouth, but couldn't find anything to say. I pulled out my phone and put it on the table. "Let's make it this way." I looked my father straight in the eye. "You wanted me to do it on my own? That's what happened. I grew up without your help." I looked at my brother. "You had all the resources to be successful, but you wasted them." My father nervously wiped his forehead with a napkin. "What are you suggesting?" he asked quietly. I paused, savoring the moment. "You think I'm that strong, right? So you'll handle it yourself." I got up from the table, nodded to the waiter to pay for myself, and turned to leave. "Daughter." My mother held out her hand, but I didn't turn around. "You'll have to learn what it's like to be left without support, like I once was." And with these words I left the restaurant. Several months passed. I didn't contact my parents. Not because I didn't care. I just knew that if they were really in such a dire situation as they said they were, they would find a way to find me. And they did. One morning, over a cup of coffee in my new office, I received a message from an old family friend. Did you hear? Your parents lost their house. They're now living in a rented apartment in a bad neighborhood. And your brother, his wife filed for divorce. I reread the message several times. So they lost everything. My brother's business went bankrupt for good. Creditors took their real estate. My parents, who had once looked down on me and said I would handle it on my own, were now left with nothing. That evening, my mother called me herself. Danya, her voice sounded low, broken. We need your help. I was silent. Please. She was almost crying now. You know we always wanted the best for you. Really? I took a deep breath, trying to control my voice. You wanted the best for me? My mother fell silent. We made a mistake, she muttered. We understand that. But now we have nothing left. I heard something drop on the phone, my father and brother arguing loudly in the background. I had to make a choice. Leave them alone with their consequences, or lend a helping hand. I sat in silence, clutching the phone in my hands. My mother's voice echoed in my head, her desperate pleas repeated over and over again. I remembered all those moments when I came to them with pride, and they didn't even listen. When they pushed me away, devalued me, gave everything I had to my brother. And now, when they had nothing left, I suddenly became necessary. We made a mistake. Those words could have changed everything. If they had said them earlier. I exhaled and finally spoke. Mom, I don't wish you any harm. So you'll help us? Hope appeared in her voice. I thought for a second. You said I was strong, that I could handle it on my own. That's why I did it. Danya, please. But what did you do? I interrupted. You gave all the resources to your brother, justifying his irresponsibility. You never asked how I was doing until you felt sick. We didn't know We knew. But we turned a blind eye. Because it was convenient for you to believe that I could handle it on my own, and he deserved more. Mother was silent. You made a choice, Mother. I spoke clearly and coldly. Now I'm making mine. Danya. I pressed end call. A few minutes later the phone vibrated again. Father. Then brother. Then mother again. I didn't answer. They created their own future. And I created mine. And it no longer turned them on. Several weeks passed. I didn't answer my calls. I didn't read my messages. But the news still found me. My brother was completely bankrupt. His business had completely collapsed. Creditors were pressing. His debts were growing. He had lost everything. His parents were desperate. They had sold their house to pay off some of the debts. But it wasn't enough. I found out that they had rented a cheap apartment on the outskirts of the city. My brother had moved in with them because he had nowhere else to live. They had never seen me before. Now the world had never seen them. One day I happened to meet my father in the supermarket. He looked haggard, emaciated, and 10 years older. He stood by the shelves, studying the price tags for a long time, apparently counting every penny. He had never saved on anything for his brother. Now he couldn't afford an extra piece of meat. I walked past, as if I hadn't noticed him. But a few seconds later I heard him say, Danya. I stopped. Without turning around, I just listened. We were wrong. This was the second time I had heard those words from my mother. But now they sounded different. Not like an attempt to take advantage, but like an awareness. I took a deep breath. It's too late, Dad, I answered and walked on. For the first time in my life I knew that they had finally understood who I really was, and what they had lost. I had no intention of going back to that story. They made their choice, and I made mine. But life always has its own plans. One day my lawyer called me. Your brother tried to sell part of the family business, he said. He has no right to, because officially it belongs to you. I froze. What? A year ago, your grandfather transferred a share of the company to you. The documents are drawn up so that you are the sole legal owner. I had difficulty digesting this information. All this time I had been in control of the business, and I didn't even know it. That same day, my brother and parents appeared in my office. They looked exhausted, confused. We came to talk. My father began. We understand that we have made many mistakes. My brother sat silently, his head down. My mother looked at me with tears in her eyes. We're not asking for gifts, just a chance to start over. I crossed my arms over my chest. A chance, I asked, just like you gave it to me. My father sighed. We were unfair. But you're not like us. Yes, you're right, I replied, leaning back in my chair. That's why I'm not going to get back at you the way you fear. They looked at each other in surprise. But I'm not your daughter anymore, I continued coldly. I'm not your family anymore. My brother raised his head. You can't do that. I can. And I will. I gave them the documents for the company they lost. You have a chance to rebuild what you've destroyed, I said. But not at my expense. I saw my father lower his head. Thank you, my mother whispered, barely audible. And I left the office in silence. That day, I closed the door on the past forever. I didn't need their approval. I knew I was worth more. And now they knew it. I've gotten used to being on my own. But life is unpredictable. Just when I finally decided I'd never look back, I got a call from Michael Randall, my father's former business partner. Laura, hi. This may come as a surprise, but I've been following your work for a long time. I need to talk to you. I immediately tensed up. Michael and my father had parted ways on a bad note. My father considered him a traitor because he left the company and started his own business. But Michael had always been the smartest of all their partners. We met at an upscale restaurant. I was expecting some kind of clever offer, maybe even a ruse. But what he said changed everything. I want to buy your company, Laura. I almost dropped my glass of water. You what? You've turned this business into a profitable empire. And I know you don't want to tie your future to this place. I'm willing to pay twice what it's worth now. Twice as much. I was speechless for a second. It meant I could start a whole new life, leave everything in the past, and never have to deal with this family again. But is it worth it? My parents and brother are already on the verge of total collapse. If I leave, they'll lose their last chance at salvation. I looked at Michael, at the documents in front of me. Here he was, my chance at complete freedom. But before I could make a decision, I had to do one more thing. I sat at my desk, staring at the contract in front of me. The amount Michael was offering was simply unbelievable. It meant I could leave it all behind and start a new life, without the shadow of family conflict, without the constant need to prove my worth to those who had never appreciated me. But could I just walk away? Laura, Michael's voice was calm but insistent. This is your chance. Don't let the past hold you back. I sighed. I have one thing to finish. I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Michael nodded, respecting my choice, and we parted ways. I went back to the office. My brother no longer owned anything. My parents had sold their house, their accounts were empty. They had finally learned what it was like to survive without their usual privileges. I called them into the office, although they didn't know why. They looked exhausted when they entered. Laura, my father began, but I raised my hand to silence him. For decades, you saw me as nothing more than a second child. You gave away my inheritance because my brother needed it more. You devalued all my achievements. My parents stood there in silence, not knowing what to say. I placed 2 folders in front of them. You have a choice. The first folder was a contract I had prepared in advance. It gave them one last chance. I could help them, but on my own terms. They were losing control. They had no right to interfere in my life. The second folder was a complete breakup. It meant that I was selling the company and disappearing from their lives forever. My father opened his mouth as if to say something, but stopped. My mother looked away. You chose your brother, I said, and now the choice is yours. My fate was decided. Mother took the first folder with trembling hands and began to review the conditions. I saw her expression change from surprise to fear. Laura, her voice was almost a whisper. You're not serious, are you? I crossed my arms over my chest and looked at her calmly. Absolutely serious. This is your chance to fix at least something. Father took the second folder, quickly ran his eyes over the text, and abruptly closed it. You can't just leave, his voice finally showed emotion. We were family. I felt the irony in these words. They only mentioned family ties when they felt bad. I was your family when I worked nights to prove that I was worth something too. My voice remained even, but there was cold steel in it. When did you give away my inheritance? When my brother was throwing money around, and you turned a blind eye to it. My father looked away. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed in front of me. We made a mistake. My mother barely held back her tears. But you can't just abandon us, can you? I glanced at the documents. You have a choice. I'm giving you the opportunity to change everything. But according to my rules, last chance. My brother was silent, sitting in his chair with his head down. He finally realized that no one would come to save him anymore. There was silence. They had to make a choice. Mother nervously flipped through the pages of a contract, as if searching for salvation there. Father sank heavily into the chair, staring at the wall. Brother, who had recently considered himself the chosen one, now looked as if all his pride had crumbled to dust. "We can't do this," Mother finally stammered. "That's too harsh." I smiled coldly. "Too harsh? How interesting. When you gave my inheritance to my brother, didn't you think it was cruel? When you said I would handle it myself, didn't you think it was unfair?" Father sighed heavily. "We were sure you were strong." I nodded slowly. "And you know what? You weren't wrong. I really am strong. And that's why I won't let you destroy me anymore." My brother finally spoke, his voice breaking. "But you can't just leave us." I leaned forward, and for the first time in a while looked him straight in the eye. "What if I can?" The room fell into an oppressive silence. My mother picked up the documents again. "Laura, if we sign..." I stopped her with a short gesture. "If you sign, you'll get a chance. It won't be free, but you'll have the opportunity to start over. If you don't sign, everyone is left with their own consequences." They were silent, and I wasn't going to wait any longer. I got up. "You have exactly 1 day," I said, heading for the door. "Tomorrow this offer won't be available again." I left without even looking back. I gave them a chance, but what they do with him is not my problem. And this time it was already my victory.